People like to believe that marriages fail because love fades. That if two people just tried harder, communicated better, forgave more, things would somehow work out. But the truth, the one nobody likes to admit, is far colder. Some marriages don't fail because love disappears. They fail because love was never the point. When Ethan Rowe married Simone Carter, there were no illusions on either side. No naive promises whispered at dawn. No fairy tale expectations about forever. What they entered wasn't a romance, it was an agreement. And that agreement would eventually destroy him. Ethan was 34, white, American, impeccably groomed, and professionally polished. The kind of man who learned early how to speak in confident half-truths and dress like success even when he hadn't fully earned it yet. He had come up through management consulting, advising companies worth billions, while quietly resenting the fact that none of that money was his. Simone Carter was 38, black, American, and something far rarer than rich. She was established. Simone didn't chase capital. She built systems that controlled it. Rail logistics, port access, Midwestern freight corridors that determined which companies lived and which ones bled. Her firm didn't trend on social media. It moved steel, grain, fuel, and futures. Quiet power, real power. She had learned early, painfully, that love without structure was just another liability. Their first real conversation happened not over dinner, but over a conference table in a private room at a Chicago law firm. Floor-to-ceiling windows, Lake Michigan gray and endless behind them. Two attorneys, espresso untouched. Simone had looked directly at Ethan and said, calmly, without malice or flirtation, "I'm not looking for a husband who needs me. I'm looking for one who understands what he's entering." Most men would have flinched, Ethan smiled, because to him, that sentence sounded like honesty. And honesty felt manageable. He told himself he admired her clarity, her discipline, her refusal to play emotional games. He told himself that this was what modern marriage looked like. Two adults aligning incentives, eliminating uncertainty. What he didn't tell himself was the quieter truth, that Simone Carter represented everything he wanted but hadn't built. Stability, access, immunity from the small humiliations of money anxiety. And Simone knew that. She had grown up watching wealth slip through black hands, not because of laziness, but because of trust misplaced and terms left undefined. She had seen marriages framed as love stories become financial disasters when love was assumed to be protection. So when she said yes to Ethan's proposal, she didn't feel swept away. She felt prepared. If this story already has you leaning forward, if you sense where this is going and want to see how far it falls, take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow the channel. Stories like this unfold best when we take the journey together. The engagement ring Ethan chose was flawless, expensive, publicly impressive. It looked exactly like what people expected Simone Carter to wear. She accepted it with a soft smile in one condition. "We'll need a prenuptial agreement," she said. Not apologetically, not defensively, just as a statement of fact. A detailed one. Ethan laughed lightly, as if this were a formality. He even made a joke about how romance was apparently illegal in Illinois. Inside, though, something sparked. Not fear, confidence. Prenups, as far as Ethan understood them, were about protecting what already existed. And Simone already had everything. He assumed the document would be about her assets, not his future. He assumed wrong. Simone didn't believe marriage was a sanctuary from consequences. She believed it was a structure where consequences should be clearly priced. She wasn't marrying for passion. She wasn't marrying for companionship. She was marrying for alignment. Ethan thought alignment meant lifestyle. Simone knew it meant accountability. As the attorneys began outlining timelines, contingencies, definitions, and responsibilities, Ethan listened just enough to feel reassured. There would be protections. There would be guarantees. There would be an exit if things ever went wrong. What he didn't understand What he couldn't yet see was that Simone Carter didn't draft agreements to plan for happiness. She drafted them to survive betrayal. And long before Ethan Rowe ever made a mistake, long before temptation or arrogance or entitlement entered the picture, Simone had already done the most important thing a powerful person can do. She had written the rules. And once rules are written, they don't care how charming you are. The negotiations began 3 weeks after the engagement announcement, once the congratulatory headlines faded and the champagne glasses were cleared away. That timing was deliberate. Simone Carter believed emotions should settle before contracts were signed. Feelings made people careless. Calm made them honest. They met again in Chicago, this time in a different room. Smaller, quieter, deliberately uncomfortable. No sweeping windows, no view. Just polished wood, muted lighting, and the low hum of air conditioning that made silence feel heavier than words. Ethan arrived confident. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, the kind that suggested restraint rather than flash. He had rehearsed this. He had read articles. He had spoken to friends who had married rich. He understood the dance. Or so he thought. His attorney, Michael Grant, was a veteran of high-net-worth divorces. White-haired, sharp-eyed, and unapologetically aggressive. Michael's job was simple: secure Ethan's future. Not love, not fairness, future. Simone brought 2 attorneys, one specialized in corporate governance, the other in family law with a background in complex asset protection. They didn't smile, they didn't posture, they listened. From the beginning, the imbalance was subtle but unmistakable. Michael opened with lifestyle continuity. If the marriage ended, Ethan should not be financially dislocated. He proposed a time-based structure. 10 years of marriage triggered a significant lump sum. Monthly support ensured dignity. Residences remained accessible. Transportation allowances were discussed. Ethan watched Simone closely as these terms were laid out, waiting for resistance. She gave none. She nodded. She asked clarifying questions. She requested language adjustments, not to reduce the numbers, but to redefine the logic behind them. She wasn't negotiating amounts. She was negotiating conditions. At one point, Simone leaned back in her chair and said something that made Michael pause. "I don't object to security," she said calmly. "I object to ambiguity." Michael frowned. "Ambiguity?" "Yes," Simone replied. "Security without accountability is ambiguity, and ambiguity is expensive." That was the first moment Ethan felt a flicker of unease. It passed quickly. He told himself she was being cautious, meticulous. That was her reputation, after all. The conversation moved forward. Pages multiplied. Definitions expanded. Marriage was described not as a romantic union, but as a shared economic enterprise. Fiduciary language crept in quietly, almost invisibly. Duties, obligations, material harm, breach. Michael flagged a few phrases, but nothing alarming. Much of it resembled boilerplate, dense, repetitive, exhausting to parse. Exactly the kind of language designed to dull attention. Ethan trusted the process. He trusted Michael. He trusted that no one would bury something truly dangerous without it being flagged. What Ethan did not fully grasp was that Simone Carter did not think like a spouse. She thought like a systems architect. She asked questions Michael hadn't anticipated. What constituted misuse of shared resources? What qualified as reputational harm? How would intent be measured? What evidence thresholds applied? Michael pushed back gently. These are edge cases. Simone met his gaze. Edge cases are where losses happen. The room cooled. Behind her composure, Simone was remembering her father's business partner, how a handshake deal had ended in litigation that cost everything. She was remembering the women in her family who had trusted loyalty over documentation and paid for it in silence. She was not angry, she was precise. As the hours stretched into days and then weeks, the document grew thicker, not longer in spirit, longer in armor. Repetition layered protection. Definitions referenced other definitions. Clauses nested inside clauses like locked doors behind locked doors. Ethan skimmed. He initialed. He deferred. He was focused on the visible terms, the numbers, the guarantees, the future he believed he was securing. He told himself this was how serious people did things, that complexity was a sign of professionalism, not danger. At one point, exhausted and eager to move forward, Ethan joked, "This thing reads like a corporate merger." Simone didn't smile. "Marriage is a merger," she said. "The only difference is that people pretend it isn't." There was a final draft, then a revision, then one last addendum Simone requested after a late-night call with her corporate counsel. It was minor, she said, clarifying language. Alignment. Michael reviewed it quickly. He approved the concept. He did not trace every consequence. And that was the moment the negotiation ended. Not with a fight, but with a signature. Ethan signed, believing he had secured his place. Simone watched him sign, knowing she had priced the risk. Neither of them spoke about love, because love was never on the table. Only terms were. The clause was not hidden. That was the most dangerous part. It wasn't buried in microscopic font or disguised as a footnote. It sat exactly where a careful reader would expect to find it, inside a section titled Mutual Fiduciary Obligations of the Marital Parties. Professional, boring, harmless sounding. The kind of heading people skim past once they believe the important numbers have already been agreed upon. Ethan Rowe believed that. By the time the document reached its final version, it was 58 pages long. Heavy, dense, repetitive. Every major concept was defined twice, sometimes 3 times, cross-referenced and rephrased in slightly different ways. It was designed to be legally resilient and mentally exhausting. Ethan read the first 20 pages carefully. Those were the pages that mattered, he thought. Assets, valuations, timelines, exit structures, the visible architecture of security. The rest felt like scaffolding. Simone Carter watched him from across the table as he flipped pages with growing speed, pen tapping lightly against the margin. She recognized the moment his attention shifted. Not vanished, just softened. It was the same moment she'd seen junior executives miss risk exposure buried in appendices. Confidence masquerading as competence. The clause appeared on page 42. It did not use the word infidelity. That word was too emotional, too subjective, too easy to argue. Instead, it used language borrowed from corporate governance and partnership law. It spoke of exclusive operational alignment, of diversion of shared resources, of intentional acts that materially compromise the integrity, reputation, or economic stability of the marital enterprise. In plain terms, though nothing about it looked plain, it said this: marriage, in this agreement, was a fiduciary relationship, and fiduciaries who acted in bad faith forfeited protection. If either party knowingly introduced a third party into the marriage in a way that violated exclusivity, and if that action involved deception, misuse of shared assets, or reputational exposure, then that party would be considered in breach. Not morally, contractually. The consequences were not theatrical. They were precise. Loss of contingent financial benefits, termination of support structures, reversion of shared privileges, fee shifting to compensate the non-breaching party for enforcement. It was not scorched earth. It was controlled demolition. The clause did not punish mistakes. It punished choices. Simone had insisted on that distinction. Her attorney had warned her. Aggressive language invited challenge. Overreach risked invalidation. Courts didn't like vengeance dressed as policy. Simone listened. Then she refined. She removed emotion. She replaced it with thresholds, proof requirements, causation, intent, material impact. The clause did not activate on suspicion or rumor. It required evidence strong enough to survive adversarial scrutiny. That was the point. This wasn't a trap. It was a gate. And once crossed, it closed quietly and completely. Ethan's attorney, Michael Grant, read the section. He recognized the structure. He understood the concept. High net worth agreements often included morality provisions. Nothing about the idea alarmed him. What he didn't do, what time and fatigue and professional arrogance conspired to prevent, was follow the language all the way to its end. He approved the clause as standard in spirit. Spirit was not what mattered. Simone initialed every page slowly, deliberately. Ethan did the same, faster, eager to be done. When he reached page 42, he didn't pause. His eyes caught the heading. He trusted Michael. He trusted the process. He trusted that no one would allow him to sign something catastrophic. When the final signature was placed, Simone felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet sense of closure. She had not written the clause because she expected betrayal. She had written it because she understood probability. Power, she knew, did not come from assuming the best in people. It came from preparing for the worst without announcing it. Ethan closed the folder and smiled. He felt secure, chosen, anchored to something permanent. Simone returned the smile politely because the clause did not need him to fail. It only needed him to forget it existed. And one day, inevitably, he would. For a while, it worked exactly as it was supposed to. From the outside, Ethan and Simone Rowe were the kind of couple people whispered about at charity dinners and industry galas. Not because they were loud or affectionate, but because they were impenetrable, elegant, controlled, effortlessly aligned. They moved through rooms like a match set, her calm authority, his polished charm, never contradicting each other, never oversharing, never slipping. Chicago adored them. They lived in a glass and stone penthouse overlooking the river, the kind of place that didn't flaunt luxury, but assumed it. Ethan woke each morning to quiet efficiency, coffee already brewed, a calendar managed by assistants, cars waiting downstairs. He no longer checked prices. He no longer hesitated. At first, he told himself this was temporary, that he was simply taking time to recalibrate after years of consulting burnout. Simone never questioned it. She didn't demand ambition from him. She didn't push him to prove anything. That, ironically, made it easier to stop trying. Ethan began referring to Simone's company as ours, not maliciously, casually, as if proximity created ownership, as if marriage blurred the line between access and entitlement. He accompanied her to board dinners, sat beside her in meetings where deals were discussed in language he only half understood, nodded along as though he belonged there by right. People assumed he did. He was her husband. That was enough. Simone noticed the shift long before Ethan did. She saw how he stopped asking questions and started making assumptions, how his curiosity softened into comfort, how he spoke more and listened less. None of it was dramatic, none of it alarming, but patterns were forming, and Simone had built her entire life learning to read patterns before they announced themselves. Still, the years passed smoothly. They hosted impeccably restrained dinners, donated generously to causes that aligned with Simone's long-term interests, traveled well, but not excessively. Their marriage became a symbol of balance, power without chaos, wealth without vulgarity. Ethan thrived on the perception. He liked how people treated him differently now, how waiters deferred, how doors opened without him having to knock. He liked the subtle envy in old colleagues' voices when they asked how married life was treating him. "Can't complain," he would say, smiling. "I'm very lucky." And he believed it. What he didn't recognize was the quiet erosion taking place beneath the surface. The way dependence disguised itself as partnership. The way ease slowly replaced effort. The way he began to confuse being chosen with being irreplaceable. Simone never corrected him. She wasn't unkind. She simply didn't intervene in lessons people insisted on learning themselves. At night, lying beside her, Ethan would sometimes watch Simone read through reports on her tablet, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes. She never looked tired, never distracted. Even in stillness, she radiated focus. "You work too much," he said once, half joking. Simone didn't look up. I work precisely as much as my position requires. Ethan laughed, but something about the answer unsettled him. It sounded less like a defense and more like a principle. Over time, the thrill of stability dulled. The security that once felt intoxicating began to feel flat. Ethan missed being admired for his own momentum, not borrowed authority. He missed feeling wanted rather than accommodated. He didn't articulate this dissatisfaction. He let it simmer, let it morph into restlessness, then into entitlement. He told himself he had earned more excitement, more admiration, more reward. After all, he had given Simone what she needed, hadn't he? A presentable husband, a public partner, a life free of scandal. That should count for something. What Ethan didn't understand was that Simone never mistook compliance for loyalty. To her, the marriage was functioning, stable, predictable, efficient, which meant that when Ethan began to drift, emotionally, psychologically, Simone didn't panic. She took note, because golden years, she knew, were rarely permanent. They were simply the calm before people revealed who they really were. The other life didn't begin with a kiss. It began with attention. Ethan met Lila Monroe at a corporate branding symposium on the near West Side. The kind of event Simone rarely attended anymore because she had long since outgrown the need to be impressed. Ethan went alone, wearing a suit that still fit perfectly, carrying a name that opened doors even when his own work no longer did. Lila was 27, smart, sharp-tongued, ambitious in a way that still burned hot instead of calculated. She worked in marketing strategy for mid-sized firms, close enough to power to recognize it, far enough away to admire it. She noticed Ethan immediately, not because he was handsome, though he was, but because he moved through the room with the casual ease of someone accustomed to being important. They talked over cheap wine and expensive ideas. Ethan spoke about projects and infrastructure, letting Simone's world blur just enough to sound like his own. Lila listened with bright focus, laughing at his jokes, asking questions that made him feel knowledgeable again, relevant, desired. He didn't mention his wife at first, not out of strategy, but instinct. Simone didn't fit the story he was telling himself in that moment. She was too real, too solid, too complete. When Lila eventually asked, because she did, because she wasn't careless, Ethan answered smoothly. "I'm married," he said, watching her face carefully. "But it's complicated." Lila didn't recoil. She didn't lean in either. She simply nodded, absorbing the information. Complicated how? Ethan hesitated, then chose the version of the truth that benefited him most. "We're more like partners than anything else. Very structured." Lila smiled faintly. "That sounds lonely." That was the moment something shifted. Lonely. The word landed with unexpected weight. Ethan hadn't felt lonely, not exactly. He had felt bored, comfortable, invisible. But lonely sounded more noble, more forgivable. They didn't sleep together that night, or the next. They exchanged messages instead, long, thoughtful ones at first, then shorter, more frequent, threaded with humor and unspoken anticipation. Ethan felt a familiar thrill return, the rush of being seen not as an accessory, but as a possibility. He told himself it was harmless. After all, Simone didn't need him. She had never pretended otherwise. Their marriage wasn't fragile. It was built on understanding, on agreements, on clarity. This, whatever it was, existed outside that structure, or so he believed. When the affair turned physical, it did so quietly, carefully. Hotels paid for with his own account, dinners framed as networking, texts deleted with ritualistic precision. Ethan was methodical, not reckless. He believed discretion was the same as safety. What he didn't understand was that deception didn't require chaos to be detected. It required deviation. Simone noticed the new cologne first, then the shift in Ethan's schedule, the subtle defensiveness when she asked simple questions. None of it triggered alarm. It triggered analysis. Meanwhile, Ethan was building fantasies. He imagined a future where he left gracefully, where Simone, pragmatic as ever, accepted the end as a mutual decision, where the prenup did exactly what he believed it was designed to do: protect her wealth while compensating him for his time. He told Lila pieces of this vision, carefully edited. "I'll be honest with her," he said. "We'll be adults about it." Lila didn't challenge him. She had no reason to doubt his confidence. Men like Ethan sounded convincing because they believed themselves. But there was one question she asked him one night, lying beside him in a hotel room overlooking the city lights. "Does your wife know you're unhappy?" Ethan stared at the ceiling, the answer forming slowly. "She knows who I am," he said finally. Lila accepted that. Simone, meanwhile, had begun documenting anomalies. Not out of jealousy, out of discipline. She did not spy. She did not confront. She did not assume. She observed. Because Simone Carter understood something Ethan never had. People didn't destroy relationships by accident. They destroyed them by convincing themselves the rules no longer applied. And once that belief took hold, the consequences were only a matter of time. Simone did not discover the affair the way people expected her to. There was no shocking text message, no lipstick on a collar, no trembling intuition in the middle of the night. What Simone noticed first was inefficiency. Ethan began to arrive late to dinners he had once treated as immovable. Meetings he used to ask about in advance slipped from his memory. He started missing details, small ones, but telling ones. The kind of details people missed when their attention was divided and their priorities misaligned. To most spouses, these would have registered as emotional distance. To Simone, they registered as variance. She had spent her career identifying weak signals long before they became visible failures. A delayed shipment, a subtle change in tone during negotiations, a minor cost overrun that suggested a deeper structural flaw. Problems rarely announced themselves loudly. They whispered first. Ethan's whispers were everywhere. The cologne he wore one evening was unfamiliar, not offensive, not strong, just new. Simone filed it away without comment. The next week, she noticed that his phone was never face up anymore. A habit change. Not proof, just data. She did not accuse him. She did not ask questions designed to corner him. That would have been premature. Emotional reactions corrupted evidence. Simone knew that from bitter experience, both personal and professional. Instead, she widened her lens. She reviewed shared calendars, travel expenses, patterns of absence. Nothing overt, nothing clumsy. Ethan was careful. He thought care was enough. But care did not erase footprints. One evening, as they sat across from each other in their penthouse dining room, Simone watched Ethan laugh at something on his phone before catching himself and locking the screen. The laugh lingered too long. It didn't belong in the room with them. Simone felt no anger. She felt confirmation. Later that night, she stood alone in her study, Chicago's skyline glowing cold and distant beyond the glass. She poured herself a single measure of whiskey and allowed herself one quiet question. Not, is he cheating? But if he is, how far would he go? That was the only question that mattered. Because the clause did not punish desire, it punished execution. Simone did not call a private investigator. That would have been sloppy, emotional. She called a compliance firm she had used during a hostile acquisition years earlier. They specialized in risk exposure, not infidelity. Their job was not to uncover secrets. It was to map liability. She framed the request clinically. I need to assess whether shared marital resources are being diverted in ways that expose me legally or reputationally. No accusations, no assumptions, just containment. The firm moved quietly, legally, methodically. They didn't follow Ethan. They followed money, time, infrastructure, the same way Simone always did. Within weeks, patterns emerged. Hotel bookings that aligned with Ethan's networking events. Rides charged to accounts he was authorized to use, but not for personal purposes. Communications routed through encrypted apps during hours he was supposedly unavailable. Still, Simone waited. She understood something Ethan never would. Incomplete proof was worse than ignorance. If she acted too soon, she risked triggering defenses, denials, destruction of evidence. The clause required more than suspicion. It required a clear line between choice and consequence. So she let the rope extend. At home, nothing changed. She remained composed, predictable, polite. She did not withdraw affection because affection had never been the currency of their marriage. She did not increase scrutiny because scrutiny altered behavior. Ethan, emboldened by her silence, grew careless. That was the mistake. Simone remembered a lesson her first mentor had taught her years ago, back when she was the only black woman in a room full of men who underestimated her. Never interrupt your opponent while they're proving your case. When the compliance report finally crossed her desk, bound neatly in understated black, Simone read it once. Then again, slowly, carefully. The threshold had been crossed. Not emotionally, not symbolically, contractually. She closed the folder and exhaled. Not in relief, not in grief, but in resolve. Simone Carter did not feel betrayed. She felt vindicated in her preparation. Ethan believed he was living a separate life, invisible to the one that sustained him. What he did not yet understand was that there is no such thing as a separate life when you are bound by fiduciary duty. And soon, very soon, he would learn exactly how expensive that misunderstanding could be. Proof is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout, it doesn't accuse, it accumulates. Simone Carter understood that better than anyone. In her world, proof wasn't a photograph taken at the wrong moment or a confession wrung from guilt. Proof was a pattern so complete it no longer required interpretation. A sequence of decisions that pointed in one direction and one direction only. The compliance firms sent weekly updates at first. Sparse, clinical, data without drama. Simone read them late at night in her study, the city humming below like a distant engine. She did not react. She did not comment. She annotated margins the way she always did. Questions, cross-references, timestamps. She was not building a case out of anger. She was building one to survive attack. The first layer was financial. Small charges, individually meaningless, began to form clusters. Hotels booked during industry events. Rides routed through accounts Ethan had access to, but no operational need for. Meals expensed under vague descriptors. Nothing outrageous, nothing undeniable, but together they sketched a map. The second layer was time. Gaps between meetings, extended networking dinners that bled into early mornings, calendar blocks labeled unavailable that coincided too neatly with the same dates in the financial logs. Simone had built companies by aligning time and money. She knew when the two began to tell the same story. Still, she waited. Because proof that could be argued was proof that could be dismantled. What the clause required was not suspicion. It required intent, conscious choice, the deliberate introduction of risk into a shared structure. Simone needed to show that Ethan wasn't careless. He was decisive. That moment came unexpectedly. A corporate credit authorization request crossed her desk late one afternoon. Routine, automatic. Ethan had submitted it before for legitimate reasons. This one was different. It routed through a subsidiary account tied to Simone's holding company, justified under a client development code. But the client didn't exist. Simone stared at the screen for a long moment, then forwarded the request to the compliance firm with a single line. Trace this completely. They did. What they uncovered wasn't just personal misconduct. It was operational misuse. Shared resources leveraged for private deception. The line had been crossed cleanly, unmistakably. That night, Simone slept deeply, not because she was relieved, but because uncertainty had ended. From that point forward, everything accelerated. The firm moved from observation to documentation. Communications were preserved within legal bounds. Transactions were contextualized. Reputational exposure was quantified. Each piece was cataloged, verified, and indexed against the exact language of the agreement. Simone reviewed the material with the same discipline she applied to mergers and acquisitions. She asked hard questions. She challenged assumptions. She insisted on redundancy. If something could be disputed, it was strengthened or discarded. There would be no weak links. Meanwhile, Ethan grew more confident. Simone's calm convinced him he was invisible. Her predictability felt like permission. He stopped double-checking expenses, stopped spacing out his absences, stopped imagining consequences. He began planning, not impulsively, strategically. He spoke to Lila about timing, about doing things cleanly, about how Simone, practical as ever, would understand. He reassured himself that he had honored the marriage, that he had played his role, that whatever came next was simply the next phase of a reasonable life. He even rehearsed the conversation in his head, how he would frame it as mutual, how he would appeal to Simone's logic, how the prenup, thick, tedious, signed years ago, would ensure fairness. He never once revisited the clause. On the morning the compliance firm delivered the final report, Simone did not read it immediately. She placed it on her desk, closed her laptop, and sat in silence for several minutes. Not to mourn, to center herself. Because once proof exists, there is no unknowing it, no returning to before. Proof is a line in time. Cross it and everything after becomes consequence. When Simone finally opened the report, she did not linger. She confirmed what she already knew. The breach was clear. The thresholds met. The language activated. She closed the folder and made one call to her attorney. "It's time," she said simply. That evening, Ethan came home buoyant, energized by plans only he could see. He kissed Simone on the cheek, poured himself a drink, and spoke casually about his week. Simone listened, serene, composed, utterly present, because she now possessed the one thing Ethan never realized he was handing her with every careless choice: proof. And proof, once complete, does not ask for permission. It waits, and then it acts. The conversation happened on a Tuesday, not an anniversary, not after a fight, not in the heat of discovery. Tuesday was deliberate. Tuesdays were neutral. Tuesdays carried no emotional residue. Simone Carter did not confront people when they were already bracing for impact. She preferred moments when they felt safe. Ethan came home that evening, expecting progress. He had rehearsed his words all afternoon, refining them the way he once refined client presentations. Calm, respectful, rational. He would speak first. He would frame the ending as mutual growth, not betrayal. He would appeal to Simone's intellect, not her emotions, because that was how their marriage worked. When he walked into the penthouse, he immediately noticed the stillness. Simone was not in the living room, not in the kitchen. She was in her study, seated behind her desk, the skyline behind her darkening into evening. She wasn't wearing silk or cashmere. She wore a tailored navy blazer, crisp and structured, the kind she wore to board meetings when decisions were final. "Hey," Ethan said lightly, stepping into the room. "You're working late." Simone looked up and smiled, polite, contained, not warm. "Sit down, Ethan," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. The tone made him hesitate, just slightly. He told himself not to overthink it. Control was part of her nature. This was fine. He sat. "I was actually hoping we could talk," he began, leaning forward, hands loosely clasped. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. About us. About what we want. I think we both know things haven't felt the same for a while." Simone listened without interruption. Ethan continued, encouraged by her silence. "I don't think anyone's at fault. We built something that worked for a time, and maybe now it's just run its course. We're both rational people. I think we can handle this cleanly." He paused, waiting for her to respond. Simone reached into a drawer and removed a thick folder. She placed it gently on the desk between them. "I agree," she said. "We should handle this cleanly." Relief flickered across Ethan's face. He exhaled without realizing he'd been holding his breath. This was going exactly as he'd hoped. controlled, adult, civil. I've already spoken with counsel, Simone continued calmly. We can proceed efficiently. Ethan nodded. Good. I assume Michael will review whatever settlement structure you're proposing. Based on the agreement, I think Simone raised one finger. Before we discuss outcomes, she said, we need to clarify terms. She opened the folder. Ethan recognized the document immediately. The prenuptial agreement. Crisp, immaculate, unchanged by time. She flipped through the pages with practiced ease, stopping at a section deep into the document. Page 42. She turned the folder so it faced him and tapped the heading lightly. Do you remember this section? She asked. Ethan glanced at the page. His confidence held. The fiduciary language? Yes. Standard stuff. Simone's eyes met his. Is it? She slid a second folder beside the first. Black, unmarked, thinner but heavier in presence. This, she said, is a compliance report documenting repeated, intentional misuse of shared marital resources for non-disclosed personal purposes. It includes financial records, time logs, travel confirmations, and communications metadata, all legally obtained, all verified. Ethan's smile faltered. I'm not sure what you're implying, he said carefully. I'm not implying anything, Simone replied. I'm stating facts. She leaned forward slightly. Over the past 8 months, you have introduced a third party into this marriage in a manner that violates the exclusivity and fiduciary obligations outlined here. She tapped the page again. You did so knowingly, repeatedly, and with material impact. Ethan shook his head, a short, sharp motion. Simone, this is a personal matter. Whatever you think I did, it has nothing to do with the contract. That, Simone said softly, is where you are mistaken. She pointed to a paragraph midway down the page. This marriage is defined as a joint fiduciary structure. Exclusivity is not emotional. It is operational. You diverted shared resources. You exposed my enterprises to reputational risk. You acted in bad faith. Ethan stared at the text. The words blurred. Material breach, forfeiture, fee shifting. That can't be right, he said, his voice tightening. Michael would have flagged this. This isn't enforceable. Simone closed the folder. I spoke to Michael this morning, she said. He has reviewed the language in full. He confirmed enforceability. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was devastating. Ethan felt the floor tilt, not violently, but enough to disorient him completely. His plans unraveled in real time. The imagined exit, the clean separation, the financial cushion he had quietly assumed would be there. No, he whispered. You're doing this because you're hurt. Simone's expression didn't change. I'm doing this, she said, because you breached a contract. She stood. You mistook my calm for ignorance, she continued. You mistook structure for softness. And you mistook this marriage for something that would protect you from the consequences of your choices. Ethan looked up at her, panic finally breaking through the polished exterior. What happens now? He asked. Simone regarded him for a long moment. Now, she said, the agreement executes. And with that, the conversation ended. Not with shouting, not with tears, but with the sound of a door quietly closing and locking behind him. The collapse did not arrive with chaos. It arrived with emails. The first notification came less than an hour after Ethan left Simone's study. A polite, automated message from the bank informing him that his access to several joint accounts had been temporarily restricted pending administrative review. The wording was neutral, professional, almost apologetic. Ethan reread it 3 times, waiting for panic to rise. It didn't. Not yet. He told himself this was procedural, a pressure tactic. Simone was meticulous, yes, but she was also rational. This would resolve itself once lawyers spoke, once cooler heads prevailed. Then his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a travel alert. His airline loyalty account had been suspended, points frozen, status revoked. until ownership verification was completed. Ethan felt a flicker of irritation. Overkill, he thought. Dramatic. He poured himself a drink and sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, half expecting Simone to appear and tell him this was a bluff, a demonstration, a warning shot. She didn't. The third message arrived just after midnight. His corporate credit authorization had been formally rescinded. Ethan's stomach tightened. He stood and walked through the penthouse, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. The art on the walls, the furniture, the view he had once taken for granted. None of it felt like his anymore. It felt conditional. He dialed Michael Grant. Michael answered on the third ring, his voice tired. "Ethan, I was expecting your call." "You need to tell me this isn't real," Ethan said quickly. "The clause, this fiduciary thing, it can't mean what she's saying it means." Michael exhaled slowly. "Ethan, it means exactly what it says." "That's impossible. You approved it." "I approved the concept," Michael replied. "I missed the execution." Ethan sank into a chair. "Missed it how?" "It's structured like a governance provision," Michael said, "not a morality clause. It reframes exclusivity as economic duty. Courts don't treat that as personal misconduct. They treat it as breach." "So what happens?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking despite himself. "What's already happening," Michael said quietly. "The contract is executing." The next morning confirmed it. Ethan's personal accounts remained untouched, but everything tied to Simone's ecosystem was gone. Cards declined, access denied, services quietly discontinued. His name disappeared from shared calendars and internal directories, like it had never belonged there at all. By noon, the first article hit. Not a tabloid, a business blog. Logistics executive enforces rare marital fiduciary clause in high-profile split. The piece was clinical, almost admiring. It framed Simone as disciplined, strategic. It framed Ethan as reckless, unprepared. No salacious details, no names dragged through mud. Just facts. And facts, Ethan realized, were far more damaging. By evening, the calls stopped coming. Friends who had once texted daily went silent. Invitations evaporated. A meeting he had casually mentioned to Lila earlier that week, one he'd promised would open doors, was suddenly postponed indefinitely. Lila called him that night. "You said this would be clean," she said, her voice tight. "You said this was handled." "It is," Ethan insisted, though even he could hear the lie now. "It's just more complicated than I thought." There was a pause. Not angry, assessing. "And the money?" she asked carefully. Ethan hesitated. "I don't know yet." That was the moment he lost her. Not because she was cruel, but because reality had arrived faster than affection could adapt. Lila didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She simply withdrew, the way people do when they realize they have misjudged the terrain. When the call ended, Ethan stared at the blank screen of his phone. For the first time, the truth settled fully in his chest. This was not a negotiation. This was enforcement. Simone had not raised her voice. She had not threatened. She had not begged or pleaded or demanded explanations. She had simply pressed execute. By the end of the week, Ethan understood the full scope of the collapse. It wasn't just financial, it was structural. His access, his status, his assumed permanence, all of it had been built on a foundation he no longer controlled. The marriage hadn't protected him. It had exposed him. And as he stood alone in a penthouse that no longer felt like shelter, Ethan Rowe finally grasped the most devastating truth of all. He had not lost Simone. He had lost the illusion that he was ever entitled to what she built. And there was no clause in the world that could undo that. The public reckoning did not come with sirens or scandal. It came with headlines written in calm, educated language, the kind that sounded neutral while quietly dismantling a reputation. The first major piece appeared in a respected financial journal 3 days after Ethan's access was revoked. It wasn't gossip. It wasn't cruel. It was worse. A case study in marital fiduciary enforcement, The headline read. Simone's name appeared first. Her credentials were listed in precise detail. Founder, controlling shareholder, infrastructure strategist. The article framed her decision not as emotional retaliation, but as disciplined governance, a rare but legally sound enforcement of a contractual obligation. Ethan's name followed later. Husband and former consultant. No mention of his charm, no reference to his ambition, just a man who had miscalculated risk. By noon, the article had been shared across professional networks. Lawyers debated it in comment threads. Executives forwarded it privately with short, loaded messages. Read this. Unbelievable. She's ruthless, but brilliant. Ethan watched it spread from his phone, a cold knot tightening in his chest. This wasn't the kind of attention he knew how to handle. He had always thrived in rooms where perception could be shaped with confidence and language. But this narrative didn't ask for his input. It didn't speculate. It documented. And documentation was unforgiving. A second article followed, this one more pointed. It questioned whether Ethan's conduct raised broader concerns about judgment and discretion, traits essential in any advisory role. No accusations, just implications. That afternoon, a recruiter who had been very interested the week before emailed to say the timing was no longer right. Another suggested postponing conversations until things settled. Things would not settle. The most devastating moment came unexpectedly. Ethan was standing in line at a cafe near the river, staring at the menu without seeing it, when the man in front of him turned around. "Hey," the man said, squinting slightly. Weren't you married to Simone Carter?" Ethan forced a smile. "Yes," the man nodded slowly. Tough break. It wasn't sympathy. It was observation, as if Ethan were a case study himself. Lila stopped answering his messages entirely. Not blocked, just gone. Her social media went private. Her professional bio quietly updated, removing any references to projects Ethan had once claimed to facilitate. She was protecting herself. Ethan couldn't fault her for that. What shocked him most wasn't the loss of affection or access. It was the speed with which he became irrelevant. How quickly people adjusted their understanding of who he was once new information became available. He had believed reputation was sticky. Simone knew better. Reputation, she understood, was conditional, maintained only as long as behavior supported it. Once broken, it didn't shatter loudly. It simply stopped being offered. At a legal symposium later that week, Simone's enforcement of the clause was discussed openly. Not by name, but everyone knew. It was cited as an example of foresight, of disciplined asset protection, of a woman who understood that trust without structure was just exposure. Simone did not attend. She didn't need to. Her absence made the message cleaner. Ethan tried to regain footing. He called old contacts, reached out to former colleagues, framed the situation as a misunderstanding, a private matter being exaggerated. But the story didn't exaggerate. It explained. An explanation is the most dangerous form of exposure. By the end of the week, Ethan understood that whatever he said now would only sound defensive, that the silence he once enjoyed as privilege had turned into isolation. He had believed the reckoning would be private, that consequences would remain behind closed doors. He had been wrong, because Simone had not weaponized emotion. She had allowed facts to speak. And facts, once public, did not need to shout to be heard. They simply remained. Waiting. Unarguable. Permanent. By the time Ethan realized he was no longer fighting for dignity, but for oxygen, the landscape had already shifted beneath his feet. The calls from Michael Grant had grown shorter, less reassuring. Michael was still professional, still precise, but the tone had changed. Where there had once been strategy, there was now damage control. "You need to understand something," Michael said during one of their last conversations. "This isn't about winning anymore. This is about limiting how much more you lose." Ethan sat at the edge of the bed in the penthouse, phone pressed to his ear, staring at a skyline that felt increasingly hostile. The city hadn't changed. He had. "What are my options?" Ethan asked. There was a pause. A long one. "There's an offer," Michael said finally, from Simone's side. The word offer ignited a fragile hope. Ethan leaned forward. "She's willing to suspend further enforcement actions," Michael continued. "Not reverse what's already been executed, but pause escalation." Ethan closed his eyes. "On what terms?" The silence returned, heavier this time. "You step back," Michael said, permanently. The proposal arrived the next morning, delivered not by courier but by encrypted email. Clean, clinical, 12 pages, no dramatic language, no insults, just conditions. Simone was not offering forgiveness. She was offering containment. Ethan read slowly. The financial penalties already triggered would stand. Assets forfeited were not negotiable. But future enforcement, wage garnishment, expanded legal actions, reputational countermeasures could be suspended if Ethan agreed to specific constraints. He would relocate, not temporarily, indefinitely. He would sign a binding non-disclosure agreement. He would agree to no direct or indirect contact with Simone, her businesses, her associates. He would refrain from public commentary, interviews, or clarifications. Any breach would reactivate enforcement immediately. It was not mercy. It was exile. Ethan laughed once, a short, brittle sound that startled even him. "She wants to erase me," he muttered. Michael didn't disagree. "She wants predictability. You've become an uncontrolled variable." The realization cut deeper than anger ever could. Simone wasn't punishing him because she hated him. She was neutralizing him because he had proven unreliable. Ethan thought about fighting, about refusing, about dragging this into courtrooms and headlines until someone blinked. Pride surged briefly, then collapsed under the weight of reality. He had already lost the narrative. He had already lost the leverage. He had already lost the assumption of credibility. Every option left to him involved choosing how he would lose. That evening, Simone requested a final meeting. Not in the penthouse, not in a lawyer's office. They met in a private conference room overlooking the river. Neutral territory, no art, no intimacy, just glass, steel, and distance. Simone arrived alone. She looked exactly as she always had, composed, controlled, unaffected by the chaos that had consumed Ethan's life. She did not sit immediately. She stood by the window, hands clasped behind her back, watching the water move. "I want to be clear," she said without turning. "This is not an apology tour. This is not a negotiation." Ethan swallowed. "Then what is it?" She turned to face him. Her expression was calm, but not unkind. "This is your opportunity to stop making this worse." He clenched his fists. "You've already taken everything." Simone studied him for a moment, not with contempt, with assessment. "I took back what I was contractually obligated to protect," she said. "What happens next depends on you." Ethan felt something inside him fracture, not pride exactly, but the illusion that he was still an equal participant in this story. "If I sign," he asked quietly, "do I get to live?" Simone didn't answer immediately. "You get to exist," she said finally, "without my shadow accelerating your decline." That was the closest thing to compassion she would offer. Ethan nodded slowly. He understood now. Survival did not look like redemption. It looked like disappearance. The papers waited on the table between them. 12 pages. One signature line. The terms of survival. And for the first time since the collapse began, Ethan understood the truth with devastating clarity. The most powerful people don't destroy you in anger. They give you a choice and make sure every alternative is worse. Exile does not begin with distance. It begins with silence. Ethan signed the agreement on a gray Thursday morning, his signature steady, not because he felt resolved, but because there was nothing left inside him that could afford to shake. When he stood up from the conference table, the room did not change. The river outside continued moving. The city continued breathing. Only his position in it had vanished. He left Chicago 2 days later with a single suitcase and a duffel bag that felt absurdly light for a life that had once filled entire rooms. No farewell dinners, no last looks. He did not tell anyone where he was going because no one had asked. He chose Duluth, Minnesota, not because it offered opportunity, but because it offered obscurity. The city was cold in a way Chicago never quite was, sharper, quieter, indifferent. Lake Superior stretched wide and unforgiving, a body of water that did not care who you had been before you arrived. Ethan liked that. He rented a small, one-bedroom apartment above a closed-down hardware store. The heat rattled. The floors creaked. The landlord asked for a deposit in cash and didn't Google his name. That alone felt like mercy. Ethan took the first job that didn't require explanation. Warehouse logistics, night shifts, manual inventory tracking. The irony wasn't lost on him. After years adjacent to infrastructure power, he was now lifting boxes inside it. But the work was honest, measurable. If you showed up and moved what needed moving, you were paid. No one cared where he'd gone to school. No one asked who he used to know. His hands blistered within the first week. His back ached in ways it never had before. He learned quickly that exhaustion was a gift. It left no room for memory. When he came home at dawn, he slept without dreams. At night, alone in the dim apartment, the silence pressed in. Not the elegant silence of penthouses and private offices, but the hollow kind. The kind that reminded you that you were unobserved, unimportant. It was in that silence that the weight of exile fully settled. Ethan replayed moments he had once dismissed as insignificant. Simone's questions, her pauses, the way she listened more than she spoke. He realized, slowly and painfully, that she had never been cold. She had been exact. Exile stripped away the stories he had told himself, that he had been unlucky, that he had been outmaneuvered, that love or its absence had been the central issue. It hadn't. The issue was discipline. Simone had built a life where rules mattered because rules protected what she could not afford to lose. Ethan had entered that life believing rules were suggestions, softened by charm and intent. In Duluth, charm did nothing. There were no second chances built into the night shift, no grace periods. If you were late, someone else took your hours. If you complained, no one listened. Ethan adapted because he had to. He learned to keep his head down, to speak only when necessary, to exist without being seen. For the first time in his adult life, he was not curating an image. He was simply surviving. One evening, weeks into exile, he pulled the prenuptial agreement from his bag. The pages were creased now, corners soft from handling. He sat at the small kitchen table and read it again. Slowly, fully. When he reached the clause, page 42, he didn't feel anger. He felt clarity. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't excessive. It was precise. It said exactly what it meant and meant exactly what it said. He had violated the structure he had agreed to protect. The consequences were not personal. They were contractual. Ethan folded the document and placed it back in the bag. He didn't tear it. He didn't curse it. He accepted it. Exile, he realized, was not punishment. It was correction. In losing everything that had propped him up, he had been forced to meet the version of himself that existed without insulation, without entitlement, without borrowed power. That man was quieter, smaller, but he was real. And as the lake wind howled outside his apartment window, Ethan understood the final truth he had spent years avoiding. Some people don't survive exile by returning. They survive by becoming someone who no longer needs to. Understanding did not arrive as forgiveness. It arrived as fatigue. Not the physical exhaustion Ethan had learned to endure on night shifts, but a deeper weariness, the kind that settles in when the mind finally runs out of lies to tell itself. Weeks into exile, the anger that had once burned hot and constant began to cool. Not because anything had improved, but because resentment required energy he no longer had. In the quiet hours before dawn, as he walked home through streets glazed with frost, Ethan began to think differently. Not defensively, not strategically, but honestly. He stopped asking why she did this to me. He started asking, what did I misunderstand? The question changed everything. He thought back to the first meeting in that Chicago law firm, the way Simone had spoken about clarity as if it were a form of respect. He remembered dismissing her seriousness as caution, even rigidity. He had assumed structure existed to be negotiated later, softened by time, by affection, by convenience. But structure, he now saw, was the relationship. Love, or whatever approximation of it they had shared, had always been secondary. Not because Simone lacked feeling, but because she refused to let feeling replace responsibility. Ethan realized something else, too, something harder to accept. Simone had never deceived him. She had never pretended to be softer than she was. She had never hidden her values or her expectations. The agreement had been written plainly, reviewed openly, signed deliberately. The clause was not a trick. It was a test, and he had failed it long before the affair began. He had failed it the moment he stopped reading carefully. The moment he assumed access meant entitlement. The moment he believed charm could substitute for discipline. In Duluth, understanding came in fragments. It came while loading pallets in silence beside men who measured each other only by reliability. It came while balancing his checkbook at a kitchen table scarred by decades of use. It came while declining invitations to explain himself, because explanation no longer served him. Most painfully, it came when he admitted that the affair itself had been irrelevant. Lila had not been the catalyst, she had been the symptom. The real breach had occurred years earlier, when Ethan began to see Simone's world as something he could borrow without consequence. When he stopped asking what his role required and started asking what it allowed. Simone had not punished him for wanting something else. She had enforced consequences for taking it improperly. That distinction mattered. Understanding also brought a strange, unwelcome respect. Ethan had spent his life admiring power when it was loud, when it announced itself through money, status, and attention. He had never learned to recognize power that operated quietly, that did not need validation to function. Simone's power had never been emotional. It had been structural. She did not react. She designed outcomes. In exile, Ethan began to understand why that kind of power frightened people. It offered no leverage, no appeal, no opportunity for negotiation once boundaries were crossed. It didn't seek dominance. It assumed responsibility. And responsibility, unlike affection, did not bend. One night, sitting alone in his apartment, Ethan opened his laptop and searched Simone's name. Not to stalk, not to obsess, just to see. She had moved on. Her company announced a new acquisition. Her name appeared in a panel discussion on ethical governance. Her public image remained unchanged, composed, strategic, untarnished. There was no mention of him. That absence hurt more than any insult could have. He realized then that understanding was not about absolution. It was about perspective. He had not been erased out of cruelty. He had been removed because he no longer belonged inside the structure he had agreed to protect. Understanding also brought grief, not for the marriage, but for the version of himself he could have been if he had taken the terms seriously. If he had respected the boundaries not because they were enforced, but because they were there. That man never existed, but this one did. The man who woke up before dawn, who showed up when expected, who lived within limits and honored them. Understanding did not make Ethan whole, but it made him accurate. And accuracy, he discovered, was the first step toward any future worth building. Power rarely announces itself with anger. For Simone Carter, power arrived as quiet continuity. The morning after the agreement was finalized, she woke at the same hour she always had. She reviewed the same reports, took the same car into the city, sat at the same conference table where decisions moved markets rather than emotions. If there was any rupture in her life, it did not show. That, more than anything, unsettled the people watching from a distance. They expected drama, retaliation, some visible scar of betrayal. Instead, Simone continued as she always had, precise, contained, and entirely uninterested in explaining herself. At a board meeting 2 weeks later, An older director congratulated her on the firm's latest acquisition, then paused. "That couldn't have been easy," he said carefully. Simone met his gaze. "Difficulty doesn't alter necessity." The meeting moved on. Privately, however, the silence pressed differently. Simone had not loved Ethan in the way novels promised, but she had chosen him deliberately. She had trusted him with access, limited, yes, but meaningful. Ending that arrangement was not painless. It was simply unavoidable. People misunderstood that. They assumed her calm meant she felt nothing. In truth, she felt too much to allow emotion to dictate outcomes. She had learned long ago that women like her were not afforded the luxury of public unraveling. A black woman with power was always one misstep away from being labeled unstable, vindictive, or dangerous. So she did not unravel. She refined. In the weeks following the separation, Simone reviewed her personal structures with the same rigor she applied to her companies. What had worked? What hadn't? Where assumptions had crept in unnoticed. She did not frame Ethan as a villain. She framed him as a risk that had not been mitigated early enough. That distinction mattered. At a private dinner hosted by a philanthropic foundation, Simone found herself seated beside Senator Marcus Hale, a man with his own money and none of Ethan's hunger. Their conversation was measured, curious, respectful. No promises, no illusions. When he asked her, later, whether she would ever marry again, Simone considered the question carefully. "Yes," she said, "but not casually." He smiled. "I wouldn't expect you to." That night, alone in her penthouse, Simone opened a document on her tablet. A draft. Not a contract yet, just notes. Lessons learned, language to clarify, definitions to tighten. The next prenup would be shorter, not because she trusted more, because she had learned how to say exactly what she meant. Simone did not regret enforcing the clause. Regret implied doubt, and doubt suggested error. What she felt instead was acceptance. Ethan had revealed himself not through cruelty or malice, but through neglect. He had stopped honoring the structure he had agreed to protect. And structures, once ignored, failed. She thought briefly of the younger version of herself, the girl who watched deals collapse because someone believed relationships were stronger than paperwork. She had promised herself then that she would never confuse hope with protection. That promise had held. Simone Carter was not ruthless. She was consistent. Her power did not come from punishment, but from preparation. From writing rules that did not require her to argue, plead, or perform outrage. Once written, the rules spoke for her. That was the freedom few understood. To never have to convince anyone after the fact. As winter settled over Chicago, Simone stood one evening by the window, watching the city lights flicker on. Somewhere beyond those streets, Ethan was living quietly, anonymously, learning the weight of consequences without spectacle. She did not think of him often. He was not an enemy. He was not a regret. He was a completed chapter, closed cleanly, without lingering annotations. Simone turned back to her tablet and resumed drafting. Because the woman who writes the rules does not dwell on what has already been enforced. She looks forward. She adjusts. And she ensures that whatever comes next is built on clarity so sharp it leaves no room for illusion. In the end, it wasn't the money that stayed with Ethan. Money could be earned again, lost again, chased again. It was fluid, temporary. What stayed was the understanding that arrived too late and settled too deeply to ignore. On quiet mornings in Duluth, when the lake lay flat and colorless under a pale sky, Ethan sometimes thought about the moment he had initialed page 42. How casually his pen had moved. How certain he had been that nothing important lived beyond the numbers. He had believed contracts were about protection. He had never considered they were about definition. He lived simply now, worked steadily, paid his bills on time. No one asked who he used to be, and he never offered. His life was smaller, but it was his. Built without leverage, without shortcuts, without borrowed gravity. And for the first time, it held. In Chicago, Simone Carter continued forward without interruption. Her company expanded. Her reputation solidified. In legal circles, the clause became a reference point, a quiet legend discussed in classrooms and boardrooms, as a reminder that foresight was not cruelty and boundaries were not bitterness. Simone never spoke publicly about the marriage. She didn't need to. The agreement said everything. People assumed the story was about revenge, about punishment, about power wielded too sharply. They were wrong. It was about literacy, the ability to read what you sign, the discipline to honor what you agree to, the humility to understand that love does not suspend consequence. The fine print had not ruined Ethan's life. Ignoring it had. And that was the lesson few wanted to hear, because it offered no villain to hate, only responsibility to accept. Somewhere between illusion and consequence, between entitlement and accountability, the truth waited patiently. Written in ink no one bothers to read until it's too late. If this story made you pause, if it reminded you of the power hidden in quiet decisions and overlooked details, take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow the channel. Stories like this aren't just entertainment, they're warnings, lessons, and mirrors. Because in the end, it's never the headline that changes your life. It's the fine print you thought didn't matter.